We would like to start the interview or this talk with a question about revisionism. That means how you see the history of historical revisionism in regard of the time of Tudjman and that what's happened after in the 90s until today. Is any kind of difference in the narratives?
First of all, unfortunately, I do not see the difference. What I see is maybe different speed with which different types of revisionism, mostly connected with the Second World War and Tito's period, are connected. It all started with Tudjman, but surprisingly enough, some of the aspects, although most of the doors were opened with him or by him, some of the aspects got worse after he died, especially over the past, let's say 5-6 years maybe. We are in 2019 now. That was also following the overall trends in Europe and similar countries around Croatia, north of Croatia, and so on. It started, and you can follow historical revisionism in a part of Europe where revisionism was something, I would say, of the everyday thing. The manipulation with the past, the importance of the past, and so on. I would say that you have different aspects. Sometimes it's simply romanticism. When Yugoslavia was breaking up, then some of the medieval heroes and the stress on something that's totally lost today, the stress on Latin heritage and the medieval period and more medievalists and so on. That simply our institutes were looking for that profile of historians and so on. So that had different aspects. If you read Croatian constitution, that was brought by Tudjman, and I think that the first part of the constitution was written by Tudjman or put there on his insistence, where he is counting what is so important from Croatian history that finally led to the independence of Croatia, of course, with him, which is, something we've seen so many times, that the end of history came with Tito, or the end of history came with Pavelić, or the end of history was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, or, So we had that type of something that was not promoting critical thinking about the past. But what we can really name true revisionism, that can be connected with similar examples in right-wing circles in Germany or in Austria or in Italy or especially Hungary and so on, that existed from the day one, I would say, with the change of the government or the system in Croatia, then the breakup of Yugoslavia. I would say that previous authorities were aware of that, because one of the unfulfilled attempts of the Croatian Central Committee or the party intellectuals before the breakup of Yugoslavia was to translate. They managed to translate or to give it to translate the memoirs of the German general in Zagreb, Gles von Horstenau, who was serving as the Nazi general here from 41 to 44, and he was extremely critical of the Ustasha practice of different kind. The idea of those in the Central Committee was to publish something like that written by a German general to show that Ustasha state was despised even by their allies in Germany, and that project was not fulfilled. I managed, or I was one responsible for publishing that many years later, in 2015, I think, or so.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us what is the role of Tudjman's project of reconciliation or pomirba within the wider process of historical revisionism in Croatia?
maybe on different levels we shouldn't maybe blame Pomirba or reconciliation he had in mind or painted exclusively with negative or black color. Because first of all he had to explain himself in a way, never ceasing to be a partisan, never actually ceasing to believe some of the communist dogmas, but at the same time becoming a nationalist and becoming a leader of a party that was, as I said, opening the doors to the most extreme right-wingers coming from abroad or allowing them to appear or reappear in the country. Tudjman in 1989, in an interview given to Polit, to journalists who are still active, described himself as a Marxist, revolutionary, historian, Croatian man. So these four things were things that were defining him. And I would say that he never actually ceased to be in love with Tito because of different reasons, both coming from the same part of Croatia. But that was partially justifying his youth. He also wanted to be accepted by the West. That's a complex Croats have or always had. So they do not want to be publicly criticized or put on the spot, especially if there are no other major or strong players around them. So in that sense, Tudjman wanted to be appreciated or accepted by the West, and being on the anti-fascist side was helping him as opposed to the Ustasha heritage that was appearing in Croatia that was not really working in that direction. And you had a conflict that was not necessarily at the beginning just an armed conflict, but since the position of Croatia with Milosevic on the other side and everything that was happening with the extreme Serbian nationalism and the feeling that federal state institutions are in the hands of those who are not for Croatia. Sometimes it's bizarre, and I can maybe add, but at the time of the breakup of Yugoslavia, Croats were occupying the most important positions. It's almost bizarre, that the head of the state and head of the government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and even the Minister of Defense were all from the Croatian list, or Croats in charge of Yugoslavia. That is comparable only to the very beginning of Yugoslavia, when on Vis in 44 you had basically Croats negotiating on the top positions, negotiating. That cannot be taken, black and white, but it's always good to remind Croatian nationalists, or to try to refresh the memory of Croatian nationalists, and to try them to explain that from the Serbian nationalist point of view, for instance. But, putting that aside, the conflict with stronger Serbia, with larger republic, with Serbia that had an unpleasant nationalist leader who was actually the strongest man in Yugoslavia. Federal institutions were, I wouldn't say totally without power, meaning that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs could do something, could phone to the right people, but all of them had to pay attention to what Milosevic was doing. And the same goes for the army, and the same goes for the republics. Republics couldn't simply ignore him. The state government couldn't ignore him. The federal government on the federal level. So Milosevic was the center of the crisis. At that moment, smaller Croatia, weaker Croatia, with unknown allies, or allies that had their own interests and also problems, was to ask for unity of sort was not negative necessarily. So where we evolved from that, that the feeling of being true Croat, great patriot, if you are very nationalist, you cannot be wrong. You know, that's always good. That's always better than to say, well, I'm open to the liberal ideas or the open society. You know, so when that deformed in that direction, plus that was followed eventually by attempt or wish to somehow balance the Ustasha past with the anti-fascist struggle, and you know, eventually, and now we come to the revisionism again, with the revisionism that was constant in the society, that was always being allowed, that was helping to win the elections, if you would tip or press those buttons of the nationalism, that was helping, that was bringing, you know, palpable results. You eventually have created a society, Croatia is becoming, you know, a highly polarized society. But you know, polarization in Croatian society is not very new. What is new, that you have a totally acceptable narrative that is never accepted, or nowhere accepted in Europe, you know. So it is equal if you say Hitler was bad and Hitler allies were equally bad because they've committed genocide and Holocaust and killed many people, and you know, there were racial laws. You know, that narrative, on the other hand, you would say, as most of our right-wing politicians are telling, just like in some European countries, you know, but we condemn all totalitarian regimes, meaning, you know, let's talk about Tito's Yugoslavia, that was far worse than anything else that happened to the Croats. So that became normalized. So his idea of reconciliation actually brought to here, and he, as I said, he opened the door for that, although maybe he wasn't the most prominent advocate of those ideas, because he had his own personal past. He had some of the reductions within himself, you know, his wife being a partisan, him being a partisan, him being a general, him being an obviously believer in some of the leftist ideas, you know, him insisting to have brigades in the Croatian army, you know, which do not fit in the overall names of the Croatian military units and so on, but insisting to have some connection with his brigade from the Second World War, meaning Tito's partisans. So you had, you know, a bizarre mix. Him being in touch and connected with his old pals from Belgrade, you know, from the 50s and 60s, and that connection had remained. He was always asking them about his new collaborators, you know, do you think that they worked or that they were connected with this or that segment of the Secret Service in Yugoslavia? But, you know, since he was the omnipotent, he was the only one actually with 100% of power, he opened the door. It's his responsibility. And then especially the responsibility of politicians that followed.
Good. If you open actually three lines that are important, one will be to think about the relation of this revisionism and this way of really hyper-nationalism today in relation to Jasenovac. This will be one question. Second question for us will be the question of the relation, what happened and what is the status of Croatia in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the time of the genocide and the war. And maybe the third line is actually the relation toward the Catholic Church, or the presence of Vatican and the Catholic Church, Pliberk and Stepinac. So I would like to start with this first line that for the public and for all of us is super important, what and how to think actually all these revisionist stories regarding Jasenovac.
Yeah, Jasenovac is very visible, or more visible than other places of mass, or other concentration camps and places of mass murders, because it was the only place of that kind not run by the Germans. So the independent state of Croatia actually couldn't tell anything to their German sponsors. what, for instance, Bulgarians could or did, or even Slovaks, or whatever, they volunteered, but we did not have that type of concentration camps anywhere else, save for Croatia. Ustasha movement was primarily anti-Serb. It was not anti-Jewish. And that's why, on one hand, you can hear those advocating or trying to somehow make a sense of the Ustasha regime, telling, well, there were so many Jews in the Ustasha army, or some of top Ustasha leaders were married to some of the Jews. That's all true, but there are also examples of Jews being saved by the top Nazis in Germany. So it's always the worst to go by those examples. We have to look at the wider picture, and the wider picture says that small Jewish community in Croatia was disappeared, 81%, meaning that the percentage is as high as in societies that were traditionally anti-Semite or had a huge Jewish presence, like in Hungary and in some other parts of Eastern Europe. So you have, and that's of course complicating things for those who want to make Jasenovac something else. Because without Jews, that would be much easier. Without Jews, and that's why they try to say, well, Jews, that was not because of all those Ustashas not being anti-Semite. That is the responsibility of the Germans. It was because of the Germans, or the Germans forced us. That's a lie, because it all started before the Wannsee Conference. Many of them lost everything, and some of them lost their lives before the final solution was even thought of or made. The plan was actually forged to the last. That they were forced to leave their apartments, and we are talking not about the big cities. We are talking about small cities as well. So you have concentration camp there. The picture with Jasenovac was also complicated with the previous regime, the Tito's in Tito's Yugoslavia, especially coming from Serbia, or from Serbian by Serbian historians or those who were writing about that, because without clear number of those who were victims there, the numbers were started to be pumped, and that was not also anything new. We had the same or similar with the First World War. So the number that was going as high as 700,000 and 1,100,000 people, that was of course ridiculous, because we were a very small and underpopulated part of Europe anyhow. But when you had that was creating, of course, a very dubious picture. And some say that the reason Tito never went to Jasenovac, was partially connected with the awareness that the numbers were being doctored and manipulated with, and so on. Okay, but then after the war for the Croatian part of the wars of Yugoslav succession, or what some people here call the Homeland War, that was also given by Tudjman, never really asked whether we should stick to that name, and what does it mean? Is it maybe the best to call the Croatian War of Independence in the same way as Stalin called the Second World War for the Soviets? But that's another story connected maybe with Tudjman, what he was. You had, after the war, finally a group of scholars that reached approximately the numbers that we could maybe trust much more, So from everything we know up to now, the number will probably stay around 100,000 people, now it's a little bit less. Now it's a little bit more than that,
yes.
But it probably, from what they know and the way how they work, of course, with better funding, we would be much closer to the final number. But it's never going to. It cannot be, because it was simply technically and because of different things impossible to do that. 700,000 and so on. So you had that. And then for as long as the narrative, or simply it was more, I would say, normal and logical. First of all, because there were no newly created, or they were not brave intellectuals who were searching for proper Croatian truth. For as long as we were, for instance, then in 1999, you know, Dinko Šakić, who was last commander of Jasenovac concentration camp, was put on trial, and he was found guilty in Tudjman's Croatia, if you wish, before we actually were negotiating for the membership in the European Union. Then with Sanader, the atmosphere, Račan and Sanader, the atmosphere became relatively normal, but that was, as I said, you know, Croats do not want to be reprimanded from Europe or from outside. So for as long as we were negotiating and trying to present a European face, that was a bit easier. You know, the things were more normal or stable, I would say. The problems erupted, and that coincided with the changes in Europe, with the new, sometimes I'm going to say illogical, but I could maybe use stronger words, a way how Poland is looking at the past, especially Hungary. You know, we have created, that came to Croatia, that coincided with the economical crisis. Croatia joining European Union, meaning that the outside authority observing the situation in Croatia was not there anymore. Plus, you had new leader of the strongest conservative party, actually movement in Croatia, Croatian Democratic Union, who also was changing his ideas, but eventually became extreme right-winger, and he opened the door to the Orban-like historical revisionism. So all that came together, you know, and then you got what you actually have still in 2019, in spite of Plenković being head of the government, who was regarded as more moderate. You have societies that are being financed by the state and government, or Ministry of Veterans of War, but that's the government, this government, reformed HDZ government that was not supposed to be as Orban government, that was anyhow brought to a quick end 6 months after the unsuccessful elections of 2016. So you have Plenković in power, but not too many changes that are visible, meaning that you have societies that claim that Jasenovac actually was not even a concentration camp during the Second World War, that it was used by the partisans after the war, although we have publications, and never ever anyone from abroad or from Jasenovac or from the region or anywhere, no one ever said anything about that. So no testimonies, no people talking, no pictures, no books, nothing was ever. On the contrary, we have books of the buildings destroyed before Ustašas left concentration camp, Jasenovac and so on. So the story goes that Ustašas were hardly killing anyone, you know. If they did, that was those who rebelled against the country. Most of them died because of typhus and the problems in Jasenovac in general. It was war. And then you had a massive murder of those after the war by the partisans. So the attempt is to simply totally change the narrative, or truth, if you wish, to tell, you know, the independent state of Croatia was actually just a normal state. Everything, well, the Jews disappeared because of the Germans, and Roma community is so small that no one actually asks too many questions, and they are not, or they were not strong enough to speak loudly for themselves. So no one, because Roma doesn't fit in the narrative, because then, well, if Germans because of Jews because of the Germans, and Serbs because they were rebelling and dying of illness. Why Roma and why it was organized, and of course why the Croats who were anti-fascist. But with anti-fascist Croats it's even less easy to explain than with the Roma, because what they want to do is not just to change the narrative. They want to have a narrative that's going to help them rule today. So their political opponents are coming from the opposite interpretation platform, telling that Hitler was bad and that anti-fascism liberated the whole of Europe, including Croatia. So it's easier to explain the anti-fascists. 15,000 Croats killed in concentration camp Jasenovac, because for them these are the same enemies as those today who are members of, I wouldn't say that members even and supporters of the left-wing parties or social democrats. Those whoever is pro-European, open society, doesn't hate Serbs, LGBT rights and stuff, he's leftist, meaning anti-Croat for the right-wingers. So when you have that, then it's then narrative about the past, especially recent past, becomes understandable. Plus, it leaves us responsibility for everything that happened. Now the problem is that you have world community that talks about or treats the Holocaust in a different light, and it's everywhere, and you cannot escape it. So you try to somehow go around. Even if you have to admit, then you concentrate on the examples that are not putting that in direct connection with the Jews, with the Eustatius. It was the Germans. You talk about Auschwitz, Auschwitz, and that's what happened somewhere else. You talk about the millions in other countries. Hardly ever about, or not enough about that what happened here. And that what happened here did not happen somewhere, hidden from view. It was sometimes in the middle of the city. When they were putting them in Križanićeva school. That's right in the middle of Zagreb. It was the summer, and one guy managed to escape. He wrote a book. He took a tram. He took a tram from there and went to. He was a kid. Not to go into details. You have that type of narrative. Well, that erupted over the past 4 years with two events. One was a plaque put there in Jasenovac's village by the Croatian Party of Rights, who had an illegal military force during the homeland war in Croatia at the beginning, before Tudjman destroyed them, sometimes physically, or merged them with the Croatian army. So now those units who were purposely following the Ustasha path from the Second World War. It's not a secret. It wasn't done in secrecy or hidden from you. It was public, open. They talked, you Google, you go read. There are hundreds of documents telling, that their Zadom Spremni, which is Croatian version of Zig Heil, was their official slogan, and that was put on the plaque commemorating several killed HOS, that's the abbreviation of their military forces, in Jasenovac. That caused, of course, stir by those taking care of Jasenovac in different ways. And this government, the liberal Angela Merkel visiting government, that government couldn't do more than to find a commission, and then after a year that commission agreed that Zadom Spremni greeting is acceptable in certain cases. The plaque was removed, not destroyed, as it was the case with similar examples during Prime Minister Sanader from the same right-wing party.
It was only dislocated.
It was moved a couple of kilometers further from Jasenovac, and now it's being guarded by the police force. So you have that was one thing connected with Jasenovac, And then, on the other hand, you have a boycott of the official commemoration by Serbs, Jews, and anti-fascists who are forming a body in Jasenovac. They go this year, in 2019, they went together. Sometimes it was unfortunately divided, that the anti-fascists and Serbs were doing that on one day and Jews on the second. But now they were together. And you have a clear distinction. With the government, there is no one. With the victims, there are thousands of people coming there, although the weather is never really very nice in early April. So you have that. It is splitting society. It's presenting a very negative picture of the society. The government has no power to do anything. Why is that so? That's another story. I think that it's also the lack of will, if not on behalf of the Prime Minister, but he is the most responsible. And just as I said, that maybe Tudjman was not maybe the most important for everything or the most responsible for everything, he opened the door. The same goes for whoever is powerful enough. So you have Jasenovac is open. It shouldn't be open. All those certain moves were done to calm the situation down, not to talk about the extremely large number of victims, but to make that manageable in a sense that we now talk about more precise numbers, which are horrible. 100,000 people for a small country, it's an enormous number, But at the same time, you do not have, in a society, the climate is not there, and the atmosphere is not there in a sense that you do not, we have 10 places where you study history. There are very few those dealing with the crimes committed during the Second World War, although it is so popular topic abroad on Croatia, or the Ustasha collaboration, government of collaborators, during the Nazi period. So that is, that's the complex story of Jasenovac. Of course, you have now Roma. Roma want their own monument there. The government is not willing to actually fulfill. So you have, it's partially, it's of course their responsibility. It happened because of revisionism, if you wish, and the open doors to revisionism that was never really fought against.
The second line, because I want to also tackle this question, because we work with history and memory, and as I said, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the genocide there in Srebrenica is one of the central moments. From today, how is this revisionism tackling then what was going on from the 90s on? How to look and to think, for example, what is now the reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina, this tripartite division, the status of Republika Srpska, the place of Croatia in all this story. So how you see this from the Croat?
Also in the context of what the Hague Tribunal called the joint criminal enterprise.
Yeah.
Well, these are two things. One was the role of Croatia and the Croats who were either convicted by the Hague Tribunal and war crimes committed by the Croats during the civil war in Bosnia. It was maybe aggression too, but it was also a civil war. Yeah. With Croatia is maybe a little bit easier because no one questions and no one talks about Srebrenica in anything that would be approaching revisionism of any kind. But that's also much easier because there are no Croats in the whole story, and plus you have the Serbs, and the Serbs in Croatia are the bad guys always and only, and then you have then it works much easier. You move. Even more, you would say that Croatian liberation Operation Storm and Flash helped Bihać not to become another Srebrenica, which might be the case with the Serbian forces around them. Now, with the Republic of Srpska, I would say that you have to distinguish between the Croats living in Croatia and the Croats living in Bosnia. It's unlike Bosnian situation. In Croatia, it's not very easy to sell that Serbs could be our allies, full stop. especially when it's something about something as Republic of Srpska, where so many Croats lived before the war, you know, where Brod or Derventa or even Banja Luka and some other places, you know, had a sizable Croatian population, you know, and that those people do not live there anymore, that they cannot return there anymore, and so on. So some Croats, especially in central Bosnia, do understand that. You know, Croats live with Muslims together in Bosnia. You know, we live together, unlike Republic of Srpska, where no Croats had returned. And that do not allow Croats to return and Bosniaks, you know, to return there. But so you have the division between Croatian corpus, I would say, in Croatia, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, not the same in Bosnia everywhere and Herzegovina, you know. So that's complicating situation, but situation is not I wouldn't even say uneasiness. It's not even uneasiness because Croats do not understand, do not want to understand the situation and don't want to deal with that at all because of several reasons. One, because obviously they do not know what to do there. No one knows how to handle Bosnia anyhow. So that's one problem. The other problem is that they knew that something not very positive happened there during the wars of the 90s, and they do not want to talk about that. So you have maybe the beginning of the war that was together with the Bosniaks, and the ending of the war that was together with the Bosniaks, but what happened in between is not really talked about, not even after the convictions came from Den Haag. So that was not covered in a sense that the whole Den Haag story would provoke some thoughts and reflections and maybe books and so on. You know, it was all regarded as the attack on the Croats. So if we are ever going to talk about, if we are going to talk about that at all, then we rather not talk about the problems that were caused by Croats being interfering there. The fact that that episode during the Tudjman years finished not really with clear or desirable results caused already there Croatian unwillingness to touch anything or to have anything with Bosnia in that way. You know, so on one hand, I think that problems within Bosnia cannot be solved unless you have both Serbia and Croatia working together with Bosnia. On the other hand, the way how Croatia deals with that, it's not helping. At the same time, it's even worse because they do not know how to handle that. So you have, and then you have divisions within the Croats, those who are totally not interested. Of course, that became something we haven't mentioned. You know, the Croats have problem with the definition of the Balkans. So since they do not want to be connected with the very term Balkans in any way, well, you know, Bosnia is more Balkans, so they some want to, you know, look in the opposite direction. You know, don't have to deal with that. So you have different layers. Why situation with Bosnia is complicated. Croatians do not really understand. You know, so what should be the final goal? You know, the final goal is. Now I can tell you how I would see that situation, but you know, if you have Croats living on one territory with one dominant nation as a constitutive part, then I guess you should concentrate on solving the problems there, you know, and hoping that the Republic of Srpska is going to assist in that struggle is, I guess, rather stupid, or that's not going to help. At the same time, Croatia will never fully accept that line, because in Croatia you cannot explain that Republic of Srpska is something that we are going to regard as an ally, you know, because in the same way as Russia became so domesticated in American policy, it's the factor of the Serbs. So you have, many people, especially right-wing people, are bothered just by the very existence. They don't have to do anything, but they are bothered that they will not. So that's what's complicating situation. Although sometimes you have the most extreme Croatian nationalists in Bosnia and the right-wingers, doing deals with the most extreme right-wingers in other parts of Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Serbia alike.
Okay, and now, now that you just tackled the third line, that is important in order to understand, and this is actually the implication of the Catholic Church. But even more, for example, all this revisionism that were connected with the Cardinal Stepinec, and also what happened recently in Pliberk. Mm-hmm. That was something new regarding the backup of these events by the Catholic Church that actually withdrew this time when it was the commemoration. And my question will be how to read now all these changes also in relations to the changes in Austria, because Austria also changes, and if you see this or Central Europe or European Union in general.
Before I answer, I think that for any small country, and especially for a small country as Croatia, even Slovenia in that, because we are, in this respect, we are the same, If the borders in Europe are going to change, meaning if the anti-fascism and world created after 1945 and on the results of which world was created, if that's going to be someone going to start to change that, that's going to be, first of all, the end of the order created after 1945, and that's going to be the end of the borders created after 1945. There are no miracles and no allies with which countries like 2 million strong Slovenia and less than 4 million strong Croatia will be capable of defending its borders vis-à-vis the neighbors of 60 million people, for instance. No way. That's impossible. That would be impossible for states as rich as Qatar that could maybe buy drones and fight, different type of war. That's not going to happen. So if Croatia is not going to be connected with the core of the continent and the values that make the core of the continent, that's going to be a very bleak history, or future is going to be very bleak. The same goes for those who applaud to Orban, for instance, because Orban's idea is to change the results of the Great War, of the First World War, and although there were few Hungarians living in Croatian lands that were part of the St. Stephen's Crown, lands of St. Stephen's Crown, Croatia is the smallest of those countries and probably could be the easiest prey if something happens of that kind. So I'm not now painting the devil on the war. I'm just telling you that if we are going to think or to continue to think in these lines, according to or along these lines, if we are going to change those results, because we are not offering new ideas, we are not offering, a multinational or different type of, man or humanoid who is going to live there. We are returning to what was not fulfilled during the Second World War, or for some, including in the Catholic Church, for the results, to undermining the results of the French Revolution, So if we are going in that direction, that's not going to evolve without opening these questions that brought to the wars and the revolutions I just mentioned. So that's an enormous problem. If politicians do not see that, and unfortunately I'm not sure that everybody sees that, that's creating also tensions within the society. The Catholic Church, as well in Croatia, as well as all denominations, And I'll be very simple here and open. I do not think that majority of them believe in the Bible or the Quran or anything else a bit. I do believe that they believe in the God of nationalism. I think that they have that in mind whenever they open any of the holy books. And that's one of the problems. You know, I believe that they do not follow the word of God because they actually don't understand it. It was never important. It was always important to be good nationalists more than anything else. So that obsession with Stepinac is connected with nationalism. You know, there are many discrepancies in that story. You know, he is almost saint because he was saving, among other things, Jews and Serbs. But from whom, we do not know, because at the same time, Church cannot condemn the second Ustasha state in the Second World War, because they have much more important enemy, and that's anything connected with Tito's time. So you have the problem. At the same time, fortunately, we are not alone. And you cannot simply isolate a country that desperately wanted to be accepted by the civilized world, meaning the European Union, to join the European Union, and now to behave that it's up to us to sort these things and to undermine the European values. So, you know, that's why you have this struggle, and that's why, among other things, Croatian society is fighting all the time. It's all, of course, a problem for the Catholic hierarchy because Catholic hierarchy never actually condemned or stated clearly what happened. In 2019, what they did, first time, was to put a banner talking about the Holocaust. But as I said, in church in Croatia, the Holocaust was not the place where the majority of victims were committed. That's fine, that's a good step in the right direction. But there were many other people, and there were many other places where people were being killed. And those were the victim nations that go together in Jasenovac. And Jews go together with the Serbs and the anti-fascists because they were also prosecuted. You know, it would be logical for the church 70, 80 years since the events, to maybe say something about that. But they cannot, because the state's not doing that. And the state's not doing that because our ruling party adopted a narrative in which, you know, it's us and them are those who are red. And the red are, as I explained, all those who are for open society, open interviews, you know, not against the minorities and so on, and you have that division. So church fits building the side of the extreme right-wingers. They're maybe not happy with the way how some of them behave. You know, they would probably not to have abortion allowed as it is. So they are trying in different ways how to work around that and to press the society, and you know, to form the medical school at the Catholic University, probably with the final goal to approach one day when euthanasia comes here, or even and now abortion, which is legal for so many decades. So that's probably the final goal. It's a political organization, you know, the problem is also that many of the priests, and that's not just Croatian church, they're undereducated. They are, you have a crisis. Not very many people want to be priests, so they accept whoever is willing, and many people are simply willing to be, you know, good Croats. That's enough. To be national, that's enough. So once that became visible abroad, although many things were visible many years ago, I would say decades ago, and Austrians had decades to observe and to come to the same conclusion as they came now. But also something in 2019, when the Klagenfurt diocese forbidden a commemoration of the previous years, the kind we had previous years, also shows something else. The level, the weight of Croatia is much smaller than it ever was. It was the easiest to obviously send the message by the right-wing government in Austria to the others, telling, you see, we are doing something about the extreme right-wingers. Doesn't cost anything, you know, it's them. It's also a message to very many Gastarbeiters who are there for not any more Gastarbeiters, but simply working and living in Austria. That's another message. And they were probably aware that they could have a conflict with the Croatian politicians here, which they had. But of course, Croats, first of all, it's smaller and weaker than Austria, you know, and they didn't yell too much because, you know, first of all, the arguments are not easy to find, and on the other hand, they are simply weaker. They couldn't, you know, that was just for the domestic use, to say, well, you couldn't, and why are you doing that now, and you shouldn't, and, you know, we talk about all victims of all totalitarian regimes, and de facto, it's not about that. It's not the talk about the victim. It's not that, it never was. Bleiburg was never really about the victims. It was, as it says on the monument there, to the killed Croatian soldiers. And then, if you are talking about the victims, there were so many victims. And it's not just Jasenovac and Bleiburg. And there are so many other victims. For instance, on Goli Otok, that where the Stalinists were going. But there is nothing there, because there were very few Croats and so many Montenegrins and Serbs. So are you going to commemorate non-Croats, you know, and how to organize that? Plus, you have the Trščina on the outskirts of Zagreb, which is a memorial place. It was during Tito's time. There are monuments there. It's a memorial wood. There are many people killed there during the Second World War by the Ustašas. You know, you have only NGOs going there. From time to time, some of the ambassadors. So if the victims are in the center, then, you know, there are different ways how to approach the victims. But we are talking about only some victims. Victims of May 1945. No other victims. And that suddenly became a problem for the Austrians. Austrians, I have to say, were easily and happily collaborating with Croats when they had to buy our banks and our companies, and when that wasn't maybe always legal, they were not bothered by that. In a way, if I may quote former vice chancellor in Austrian government, you know, they helped this country to become or to remain Scheiße. But now with this, they did something, I would say, that helped Croatia. That pressure coming from Croatia helped to Croatia, helped forces within the country to say, come on, you know, you're not doing, for too many years, we were just pretend, or you were pretending and making us, or thinking that we all others believe that you are talking about the victims.